Hello, everyone. Now to finish on part two of our Spanish involvement. First one, we discussed how Louisiana was kind of suddenly slipped off to the Spanish without the locals even knowing what's going on. Then we had Don Antonio Ulla arrive as the first governor, who turned out to be an absolute disaster on so many levels. As a result, there was a revolution in Louisiana, in New Orleans in particular, and there's no telling where it might have gone. But then the Spanish decided to reaffirm themselves. At first, Carlos III more or less shrugged his shoulders and figured, well, I didn't expect anything different from these Frenchmen. But then his advisors informed him that you can't let this go unpunished. You've got to exert your control. Otherwise, it might have significant impact on your relations with the rest of your colonies. At which point he sent in Alejandro O'Reilly, whom we discussed as a military leader, who crushed the revolt, executed the ringleaders, punished others, totally imposed Spanish control, but at the same time worked out good relations with Native Americans, set up the Cabildo, and brought Frenchmen under the Spanish realm somewhat peaceably, if you can imagine that. He gave them authorities, he treated them fairly, and they apparently responded as well. He only hung around for about 7 months. His job was to create order. He's not an administrator. So he turned things over to Luis Gonzaga. And as I've mentioned earlier, under the Spanish, it was different. The French seemed to come up with a governor and then pull one out the back of their boot somewhere else. And there was never any sense of orderly transition. Under the Spanish, there's continued orderly transition in the sense that when he leaves, O'Reilly, Luis Gonzaga takes over, but Luis Gonzaga has already been there. So he knows the people know him, he knows what's going on. This isn't a new position. It's a new position, but it's not something he's unaware of. We'll find that'll be the trend among the Spanish. This is Luis Gonzaga. It's absolutely a question that this man is Spanish. And he's close to an ideal ruler in so many ways. Again, bringing this map back, we have British West Florida, the 14th colony, not 13th. This is something that he's keenly aware of because when he takes over, the American Revolution is really starting to go. It's after the Boston Massacre. Violence has already taken place. Protests are happening. So England and the colonies are having at it. A lot of royalists who support the king find it uncomfortable on the East Coast. They're coming into this area with their slaves and settling it. It's kind of a remote British colony. But because it's a British colony, and here's New Orleans here, it places pressure on Spain because they're right along the Mississippi River. And as I've mentioned earlier, at Manchac here, they're trying to divert the trade to come through these lakes and out into the Gulf instead of coming all the way down the Mississippi River, which saves 10 days in trade. So there's tensions here. That's Manchac. And that's the route they would take. A lot shorter. So he takes control in 1769 while O'Reilly is still there. And then once he's in here, O'Reilly leaves. He endears himself to the local French population because he immediately marries the French daughter of a local wealthy merchant, Marie Elizabeth Saint-Maxat. This endears him because they have their wedding party. Of course, you're going to have that, especially a wealthy New Orleanian. And he becomes part of the French culture by marriage, which is an important element. He encourages his soldiers to marry into the local population as well. This in some ways resembles Alexander the Great, the idea of melding your army with the local population. He appoints a large number of local Creoles, French Creoles, to positions in government. I trust you. I need you. Let's work together. And so he's accomplishing that task. He allowed trade with non-Spanish possessions. He realized, look, I know you guys are upset about mercantilism and the threats it has on your businesses because your whole apparatus is based upon trade with France. Don't worry about it. The important thing is economic revival. So whoever you have to trade with, feel free to do so. He permitted floating warehouses. What was that? He didn't want the British to physically have a presence in the colony. That would create a problem, and they weren't trusted. But he needed some trade with the British, and the British needed trade with the local Spanish. So what he established was local warehouses, floating warehouses, where the British could take a ship, load it up with goods, bring it down to Mississippi, and anchor it in the Mississippi. Mississippi River was more or less legally neutral territory. So as a result, the English could park their ships there without in any way abrogating the idea of putting British merchants in Louisiana. And people wanted goods, they could row out to them. So it's kind of like a floating convenience store. And that's in essence what he was able to create. Now, the American Revolution is gearing up, and he finds himself getting drawn into it. Captain George Gibson, who's high up in the ranks of the American military, arrives in New Orleans with a letter from General Charles Lee, who's number 2 to Washington. They're seeking help, and he helps. Now, Gonzaga sold him $10,000 worth of gunpowder and accepted a draft from the government of Virginia, endorsed by Oliver Pollock. So what's this about? The Americans need gunpowder, and they have $10,000 to pay for it. But Gonzaga is concerned for obvious reasons. He doesn't want to get drawn into the American Revolution, into a struggle between the English and their colonists. Not a healthy position, not at this time anyway. So what he does is Oliver Pollock is a local businessman. So his idea is I want to help the Americans because there's always tension between Spain, France, and England. So by having Pollock as an intermediary, he has a right to denial. I didn't sell any gunpowder to the Americans. I sold it to Oliver Pollock. What he did with it was his business. Why don't you talk to him? And that's in essence what happened. Pollock had got 9,000 pounds of gunpowder from the Spanish store and then paid the Spanish for it, and then subsequently turned it over to the Americans. Spain would now finding itself more often than not supplying other goods to the American revolutionaries under cover of smuggling. But while doing this, even though he recognized its importance, he had concerns. One, they were a traditional enemy of the British, so doing this was actually almost fun. But should they be endorsing a colonial revolution? They just put one down themselves. What message were they sending to the French who had just revolted? Oh, it's okay if you encourage somebody else, but if we do it, it's bad. Could Spain get drawn into a world war? Because if Spain enters into this war or gets drawn into it, it now becomes bigger than just in the American colonies. It starts touching on Europe. With American independence and the removal of the British threat from the colony, that's a good thing because the British were very powerful. American victory would protect Spain's colonies in the Gulf because the British wouldn't have a base of operations to work out of. So that would make things difficult for them. But the American are expansionists. People are flying in all over Europe into America and looking for land. Would the Americans become more of a problem than the British already have become? So these are the thoughts that are running through his mind. Who is Oliver Pollock? Oliver Pollock, get this out the way, is one of the largest contributors to the American Revolution. He gives $370,000 in money at that time. That's not moved up for what it would cost today. It just goes to show the size of his investment. He's a great salesman. He makes his reputation under O'Reilly. When O'Reilly takes over, there's problems with food and flour, as we talked about the shortages. Oliver Pollock shows up with a shipload of flour and offers to sell it, which O'Reilly desperately needs. So of course he's expected to get taken advantage of. And when he approaches Pollock, all right, what's it going to cost me? He tells him, I'll sell it to you at my cost. O'Reilly's like, all right, where's the hook in this? because I desperately need it, and cost is amazing. I expected you to add 200 or 300%. He says, all I want's good relations. Well, it was a smart move because he gets the flour he needs, O'Reilly. It settles down the tensions with lacks of food. And as a result, he becomes a special friend of the Spanish government. So when Spain controls the Mississippi River in New Orleans and sometimes shuts it off to trade, it never shuts off to trade on Oliver Pollock's boats. As a result, word spreads further upriver, and you realize if you're going to ship something and you want to make sure it gets to market, you put it on a Pollock boat. It will get there. He's protected. So his venture, his investment, paid off very well. So as a result, he's got 300 to 400 boats operating on the rivers of North America and generating tremendous amount of wealth with it. He would not only give money to Americans, but he would also use up his credit to help the revolution. When the fighting ended, Pollock approached Congress hoping to get back his money. He saw it as a loan and figured they'll pay me back. He received a very cool reception. They weren't interested. When he tried to make some of his money back, he went to Cuba to open up his businesses, but because he was in debt, he was placed under arrest. So this is a man who sacrificed everything. Governor Galvez, who would be governor here in Louisiana at the time of his arrest, made sure he got him out of prison because he knew the level of his sacrifice. So he used his influence to achieve that. He put up the money necessary. And 10 years later, the only thing Oliver Pollock got out of all of his contributions was he was allowed to finally become an American citizen. That shows you the value of American citizenship to some people, what they're willing to sacrifice and go through. Gonzaga's term is over fairly soon. Don Bernardo de Galvez now becomes governor, and he likewise is already present and steps into Gonzaga's shoes. Here's Governor Galvez. He's a member of a highly respected family. His father was the governor of the Canary Islands. Now, you want to keep that in mind when we think of the Islanos. His uncle was the viceroy of Mexico, the top guy in Mexico. So you can see this young man is very well connected. His early years, he proved his bravery when fighting the Apache Indians when he was in Mexico with his uncle. So people had respect for his leadership and his fighting ability. He returns to Mexico, from Mexico. When he gets back to Spain, they enroll him in the French Naval Academy because the Spanish don't have anything similar to it. So he learns what's necessary for naval purposes, but at the same time, he picks up French culture. He learns language, adapts to culture, enjoys the wine, and enjoys the cuisine. Excuse me. So when Galvez comes to Louisiana and takes over as governor, he fully understands and loves things French. So he takes over in September 1776. The Americans declare independence in July 4th, 1776. So this is just a short 2 months later, he takes over. He makes great strains to break down anti-Spanish feelings by marrying another St. Maxim daughter. So St. Maximus had two daughters married to two consecutive governors. And again, this emboldens the French to have greater respect for the Spanish authorities. His goals, he wants to restore Spanish respectability in the community, deepen the love and attraction. He wants to develop economic regeneration. He wants to restructure it politically. He wants to encourage economic development by getting colonists, whatever the Spain can do, to get this economy going. This is what the Spanish are doing. Remember, under the French, nothing had been achieved. He wants to build the defenses for the colony because as the revolution is going on, England is becoming more aggressive in North America. Obviously, there's a war on. But he's also got a keen eye on that 14th colony, West Florida, and he's concerned. He offers subsidies for producing tobacco. He pushes free commerce laws of 1778 to allow people to trade. He was going to do anything he can, but then he'll close these English floating warehouses because tensions between France and Spain are starting to grow, and he doesn't trust them. The Islanos. Galvez's father was the governor of the Canary Islands. He turned to his father because as he's looking at the situation with West Florida, he realizes I need to have a protective boundary. So he turns to his father and asks him to send him some soldiers. And he does. But it doesn't just send men, he sends entire families. The men are soldiers, they'll be fighting, but they'll come with their wives, their children, they'll come with the necessary tools they need to cultivate and build communities. So they were fully equipped to farm. Interesting, they had to at least be 5'3" tall, which sounds shockingly short in today's world. But back then, that was about average height. The first ships will arrive in 1778. Galvez would then place them around the British colony. He opened Galvez Town, he opened Valenzuela, and he moved them into St. Bernard, which was named St. Bernard after Bernard de Galvez and St. Bernard, and it was also done by Bernard de Marinis. There's a lot of Bernards floating around here. The point being that these three locations were on the perimeter of West Florida, and as a result, he felt like he could keep a closer eye on them, and should the need arise, he would have the military positioned in the right places. The Mardenari, the land below in St. Bernard, and they were the first line of defense against any British attacks or incursions. The American Revolution is percolating. The importance of the Mississippi River was realized during the Revolution. Spanish furnished gunpowder, weapons, and food up the Mississippi River to the American rebels. It began, as I mentioned, with George Gibson traveling down for supplies for Fort Pitt, and this avenue of trade will continue. Okay, it continued throughout the war. Now, we're not getting into too much in the American Revolution. The American Revolution had been going from 1765. We're now in 1779. That's 14 years later. The British make a major play in northern part of New York in order to crush the American army. But they foul up, without getting into details, it's just sufficient to mention that at the Battle of Saratoga, up in Maine, about that area, Maine, New Hampshire, upstate New York, that whole little corner there, next to Lake Champlain, they plan this three-pronged attack, which fails. The Americans win, and General Cornwallis and his army are captured. The British are shaken. This is major. They can't believe a disaster of this sort has been visited upon them. France and Spain look at this, and undoubtedly they figure, well, for 14 years, America has been struggling with the British, and the British can't put them under control. Now, with this major victory by the Americans, it seems even less likely that the British will be able to bring this thing to a successful conclusion for them. If we were to throw in with the Americans, that would decidedly turn the tide against the British, whom we don't like anyway. It would also position us to be at the peace treaty signing, but we can make certain demands. So France and Spain declare war on Great Britain. On May 8th, 1779, Spain declares war on Great Britain. Word gets to Galvez about this early on, and he starts making preparations. He's at war. Governor Johnstone in Florida never gets notified. I mean, there's an attempt to do so, but for some reason, the letter's lost in the mail or what have you. It doesn't really get to him. So it's a situation where Johnstone has no indication that anything's going on, and Galvez is getting ready to make a strike. So his operations, he enlisted the support of slaves and offered them freedom. He has a French militia militia, the Islanos, Spanish soldiers, and the Free Black militia, who've always played a significant role in Louisiana. He first goes upriver to Fort Manchac with 760 men. He takes Fort Manchac. The British then move to Baton Rouge. He attacks the force north of Baton Rouge near LSU. And he does this by, when approaching the forts, he gets his men to make a lot of noise in the front of the fort. So the British moved their cannons and everything to the front that night, waiting for attack in the morning. When the attack comes, Galvez attacks them from the back of the fort, which he discovers is weak. So they take the fort immediately. So now the British are out of Manchac and Baton Rouge. He sends some prisoners, along with some Spanish soldiers, to Natchez, telling them, "You'll be invaded if you don't surrender." They surrender. He has now gained control over the Mississippi River. He then builds a fleet. Remember, he's got a naval background. He attacks Mobile Bay and he takes Mobile. Following that, he plans an attack on Pensacola, but a storm comes in, which disrupts everything. But finally, what he does is he rebuilds his navy after the storm, and he lands on Santa Rosa Island. And he's planning to go into Pensacola. This is where he'll get on his heraldry, on his coat of arms, "I alone." Because what happens is, by this time, the Spanish fleet has arrived from Cuba. But the Spanish admiral is concerned because the British have well armed Pensacola and the mouth by Santa Rosa with guns, and he's not interested in running that gauntlet. Galvez looks at him, he says, "If you don't go, I'll go alone." And he does, and he succeeds. The other captains on the fleet decide to follow Galvez. In the process, a lucky shot hits the magazine, blows up the British magazine, all their ammunition, so they're forced to surrender in May 1781. So in essence, Galvez has conquered the 14th British colony, West Florida, during the American Revolution for Spain. On the lakes, along the Iberville Passage and on Lakes Pontchartrain and Maurepas, Spanish gunboats spread out from Bayou St. John. They captured 3 galleries supplying British supplies, delivering British supplies to Manchac. They took 2 cutters that were sending provisions to Pensacola, so they're seizing control of the waterways. Carlos Grand Prix, commanding a British militia, establishes 2 posts on the Amite River. And the English frigate West Florida, which had been terrorizing ships in the lake, has now been taken by the Spanish forces under American privateer called William Pickles. The next day is when Galvez took Baton Rouge. Pickles raised the American flag on North Shore. So it's not only naval, but land operations which seized that area. Fort Panama is what the British had renamed Fort Rosalie. They heard along the Gulf Coast that Galvez had been defeated and possibly killed. So they attacked the fort internally and seized several of the general Spaniards, held them prisoner, and killed several of the other ones. Then they heard that that was fake news, if you want to call it that Galvez was very much alive and had actually won. At which point Galvez was furious that these men had betrayed their oath. He organized an assault, took the fort back, captured his enemies. He had 2 of them tried in prison who led the revolt, and they were sentenced to prison for 2 years. British West Florida was now Spanish again, because when a treaty was signed that ended the American Revolution, Spain said, "Oh, by the way, I want back Florida, which you took in the French and Indian War." Galvez will leave. He did much to build Louisiana's economy, military effectiveness, and a great sense of pride. He emerged from the American Revolution as Spain's greatest military hero. He'd be treated to Mexico, where he'd take the top office as Viceroy of Mexico, a significant promotion. But sadly, he died just a few years later in Mexico of an illness at the age of 40, thus ended this wonderful career. Next in line is Esteban Miro, who, like Galvez, was in Galvez's office when Galvez left and assumed the governorship. Like Galvez, he also married, but this time it wasn't of Messem accent, it was Marie Celeste Eleanor McCarty. He worked to improve the city's image, outlawed Sunday work, which they had seeped in, imposed rules governing taverns, restricted the sale of alcohol, passed laws governing travel and behavior of slaves, which was just an adjustment to the black slaves, improved relations with the Indians, gave them presents, and pushed for free trade. So you see, the Spanish authorities now are trying to run it like an efficient colony, whereas the French were all over the place. His policies extended Louisiana colony further north by establishing a presence at what is today Monroe. He accomplished his 20-year establishing local land grant policies, which some of the property to this day, if you look at the surveys, are predicated on these Spanish land grants. Commercial policies, civil laws, military preparations. He's building the infrastructure for a strong colonial base. As time went on, numbers of Americans started flooding into the territory, and that became the problem. Too many Americans with their different attitudes and different notions about life. In 1784, the colony had 25,000, 5,000 living in the city of New Orleans. So the population had gained 2,000 in the city. Other issues that come up, we'll talk about this as code duello. What is that? Throughout the French, but in particular the Spanish period, there was a problem with dueling. People would get into duels, have their differences. Gentlemen never got into a fist fight. That would be a social outrage. That was unbecoming. So if you had a difference, you had a duel. You challenged the person to a duel. And if you were challenged, you couldn't refuse the challenge. To do so would be considered an insult to you. No one would deal with you. You were perceived to be a man of low character, a coward. This is the wrong dates. It's most prevalent in 1760 to 1860. The least breach of etiquette, the most venial sin against politeness, even the least suspicion thrown of an unfair dealing, a bit of awkwardness, a cause is sufficient for cartel, which no one dares refuse. A cartel is a duel. It could be a simple matter as that you're at a dance and you see a young lady, you ask her to dance, another man has designs on her, he challenges you to a duel. What are you going to do? You got to do it. Rapiers and broadswords are most popular. Generally among the French and Spanish, it wasn't a death as a result of dueling. It was first blood. In the death, only Americans arrived. It came down to shooting with guns and blunderbuss and killing one another. For the most part, it was just simply first blood, where in a duel, if you get nicked, it stops. Blood's been spilled. The seconds step forward. Let me explain this. The way a duel worked is if you were challenged to a duel, the two individuals themselves contact ended at that point. They had what's called seconds. Both sides would have two gentlemen that would represent them. They'll get together, and first they'll try to do is avoid the duel. Is there anything we can do to avoid this? No use spreading unnecessary blood. And if they can, great, they negotiate an arrangement. However, if they reach an impasse, they're stuck with the duel. So then they have to make the arrangements. The arrangements basically are the person challenged has the choice of weapons, time, and location. So it doesn't give the advantage automatically to the person causing the duel. The advantage goes to the challenged. Once they get on the field of conflict, it's the second's responsibility to see to it that their person lives up to the rules. If he does anything to violate the rules, it's their responsibility to stop him, even if that means killing him. So it's an interesting twist. So what would happen is when the dueling was taking place, the first time somebody was struck, let's say with a rapier, they were and bled a bit, even a little bit, it was first blood. The seconds would call for a halt, and they would ask the individual who had inflicted the wound, "Are you satisfied?" If he is, then the duel's over and he's established the fact that he won, and that's sufficient enough. If he's not, the duel goes on until satisfaction is reached. Perhaps that might be where the origin of the term "to make a point" comes from. Because if you stuck someone, you definitely stuck a point in them and you made your point. There's no sense in going any further. You're not trying to kill anybody. Now, Bernard de Marigny, this shows you how things can get crazy. And James Humble. Bernard de Marigny was a Frenchman, a land investor, very wealthy, short, little fiery guy. Somehow he got into an altercation with James Humble, who's a 7-foot blacksmith. And I'm sure when your seconds arrived, the blacksmith is like, "Look, I got nothing against this Frenchman. I'm a blacksmith. I have no desire to deal with him. Besides, I don't know how to handle a sword fight." He was then informed that he can't refuse because to do so would wreck his business. He's got to accept. But then informed that it was the time, the location, and the weapons, he seized upon an idea. Told the seconds. The seconds were shocked. They went back to Bernard de Marigny to report what he had requested. Marigny likewise was shocked. And as the legend goes, picked up a bottle of wine, went over to Mr. Humble, sat down, drank wine, and forgot the whole matter. The reasoning was that Humble had said, "Okay, he's 5'3". So this is the deal. We're going to meet at sunrise. We're going to meet in 6 feet of water in Lake Pontchartrain. And the weapon of choice will be sledgehammers. There's no possible way that Marigny could win this thing. He'd drown before he could pick up the sledgehammer. It was a stroke of absolute brilliance. So ended that cartel. Governor Miro sought to end these practices by declaring them illegal, but with little success. They would continue. These are the dueling oaks. Originally, they would duel behind the cathedral, that little San Andrew Park. But then it got kind of rambunctious with crowds and everything. So they moved to the Allard Plantation, which is the site of City Park. And they had a set of dueling oaks, which are still there. They were legitimately dueling oaks. And that's where men would fight it out. It was remote. It was a back of town. Eventually, that became too much of an issue. So they would take boats and go across the Lake Pontchartrain to the Fontainebleau Plantation, which is now Fontainebleau State Park, which was owned by Bernard de Marigny, and they would duel there. The question wasn't to have spectators. The question was to prove your point. Miro wanted more people, so he openly, now that the British are gone, welcomes Acadians in. By 1780, thousands of more Acadians arrive in Louisiana. With the British gone, there was no problems where they would locate. They start settling more to the southwest. Adding to this, the King Charles III contacted the French government because many of these Cajuns had gone back to France, but they weren't welcomed. They didn't like them. They hadn't been in France in 1604. They were perceived to be foreign. Their language wasn't right. There was just tension now. So this was an opportunity to give them a chance to go someplace new where their family and relations were. And that's when they came to Louisiana. The Aslanos was settled in 1778, and they would continue to come in for nearly a decade, even after the war. Okay. And after the war was over with, Galveztown and Venezuela, who were close to the British settlement, but were often overrun with water, were allowed to leave. And they would end up moving into St. Bernard. Some would move into New Orleans, where they become part of the local population. And supposedly some actually went towards Houston. Manila Village, which is an interesting story. In 1765, a crew of a Philippine schooner jumped ship. Conditions on those schooners were tough for the Asians, and they fled into the marshes and met with some of the Maroons that were out there. About 300 of them, because over time this happens more and more, will establish in Barataria Bay and also along Lake Bourne, an area called St. Milo. It was an elevated village, like on a platform with huts on it, mostly just men. And they fished and partied and drank and fished. And they collected their shrimp. And what they would do is there's a big old platform. They'd lay canvas out on the platform. They would lay all the shrimp out on the canvas and let them dry in the sun. And once they got fully dried, they would have a celebration called Dancing the Shrimp, where they would take their shoes off, they would play music, and they would literally dance on the shrimp. By doing so, they broke the shells and left just the dried meat. After they got finished dancing, they'd grab the corners of the tarp, throw the meat in the air, a breeze would blow the shells away, and all that would collect in the middle was the fresh meat, which they would then package and sell in New Orleans or store for themselves. New Iberia, which is New Spain, well, the only true Spaniards came from Malaga, Spain. They moved into the Biotech area. This was really the only true Spanish colony that was established under Spanish rule. Haiti. This is Haiti, off to your left there. Okay, this area right here. This is Santo Domingo. This is Haiti. Haitian refugees. Saint-Domingue was the most profitable colony the French possessed. It supplied rum, sugar, tobacco, and indigo. We'll discuss indigo. So it's very, very wealthy and very profitable for France. In August 1791, a slave revolt occurred in Saint-Domingue. Apparently, it's tied to the French Revolution because the French Revolution went through about 5 different revolutions. And at one point, there was a very strong Republican government, which declared slavery illegal and freed all slaves in the French Empire. That government was overthrown. A new government came in and said, not so fast. They recognized that Guadeloupe and all these other islands that were associated with, especially Haiti, had slaves on them, and these slaves are producing wealth. There's no way they could end that. The planters, in particular, were furious. You don't tell people who are slaves that they're free. And then a little later tell them, no, I changed my mind. You're back to being slaves. This is especially the case on sugar plantations because the slaves aren't armed with cotton balls. They all have these cane knives. These are dangerous weapons. You had 350,000 slaves and about 10,000 owners, and the owners were white and free people of color. It was the largest slave rebellion in the Western Hemisphere, and this will have a tremendous effect on both Louisiana and American history in due time. The slaves killed mainly the white and black slave owners. 100,000 to 500,000 were killed, 24,000 to 40,000 owners were killed. If you read some of the accounts, it's absolutely brutal and horrifying, the amount of violence that took place on that island. By 1792, slaves controlled 1/3 of the island. Louverture would be betrayed. Louverture was the leader. Toussaint Louverture was the leader of the rebellion. He was a general, very smart man. He's betrayed because the French offered to talk to him about peace. When he meets with them, rather than conducting a legitimate conversation, they arrest him, send him to France, throw him in irons in the Bastille, where he dies. He's replaced by Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who's furious about the way he was treated, and his level of violence is off the charts. So those who could flee, realizing the situation, how bad it is, came to Louisiana, and they brought their slaves with them. So you had this tremendous influx coming into Louisiana of French-speaking people from Haiti. They brought their culture, their cuisine, their religion, and voodooism. This is major. You have a great influence on the whole, every aspect of New Orleans culture: business, arts, food, fencing, everything you could possibly imagine. There are a few links there. We don't have time to get into them here, but they're worthy of looking at. This is Toussaint Louverture. He's considered the Napoleon of Haiti. This is some of the rebellion. See, this gentleman's holding up a guy's head. People were burned alive, slaughtered, butchered, massively executed. Here you have some more of the fighting. Hanging French soldiers. Different paintings showing the level of discord. So that's the situation in Haiti, and you have an influx of almost 10,000 people here into Louisiana. This will contribute to the discovery and use of granulated sugar. Sugar had been introduced by the French Jesuits, and it was cultivated, but there was of little use really, because you couldn't granulate it. You can't ship it unless you can granulate it, because it's too sticky of a mess. But you can use it because you can refine it down to a point where you just, you know, crush it and boil it, and you end up with some crystallization. And you can make scoops that make a mold and make a scoop, and then this heavy, thick molasses type sugar, they'd use it as a sweetener. Or they would distill it to make tafia, which was a form of rum. Down here in St. Bernard Parish, in 1791, you had Manuel Solis and Mendez. These two gentlemen were of Cuban extraction, and they had a slave. His name was Morin. Likely he was from Haiti. So he knew how to granulate sugar. So what happened was, excuse me, you have the plantations in St. Bernard Parish, and people would live in New Orleans and have an overseer run their plantation. But they would sometimes go home and have dinner parties. And that's what he does. He conducts a dinner party with a group of his friends who also live in a quarter, Creole friends. And after dinner, he serves them coffee and sugar to sweeten their coffee. They're dumbfounded. Where did you get this? I made this. You didn't make it. Nobody knows how to granulate sugar. I made it. Word spreads. Etienne de Boré, who's publicly credited with the cultivation of sugar, is a businessman. He owns a plantation on what is a site of Audubon Park. He's growing indigo, but the indigo has a rust and it's dying, and he's losing profits. When he hears about this, he hires Morin. Now, we don't know what that transaction is, whether he's hired on his own, whether it's contract with Solis. Those particulars are not known. He gets Morin. He plows under all of his indigo and he plants sugar. Everybody thinks he's completely lost his mind. Nobody does an entire plantation of sugar. You just do a little bit for your own purposes. When it came time for the grinding season, which was right before the first freezes, he cut all the sugar cane, ground it all up, and started the process of refining with Morin supervising. And sure enough, it granulated. There's a trick to it, and Morin understood that. Once it granulated and it was able to come up with dried sugar that he could ship, he sold his first harvest for $12,000, which cleared all of his debts. Within a short time, 22 other sugar plantations spring up along the Mississippi River, and they start working further into St. Bernard Parish and then downriver into Lafourche. The Spanish have now discovered an incredibly lucrative cash crop for Louisiana. Another individual at this time is Pierre Antoine. I'm talking about different vignettes, so to speak, of Louisiana history under the Spanish. He came to Louisiana representing the Spanish Catholic Church, and he was appalled by what he saw of the French version of what was going on. We talked about that when Uya came in. He was equally upset. He began to set up an Inquisition, which was that everybody was afraid of. I don't know if you know what the Spanish Inquisition was, but it was incredibly brutal. You had to accept everything in the Spanish Catholic Church. You were put to torture if you didn't, and if you were considered a heretic, you were burned at the stake. He sees the condition of Catholicism here in Louisiana, and decides that he wants to impose the Inquisition. So he wants people arrested and brought before the governor to begin the process. This is under Governor Miro. Miro tells Pierre Antoine, you will have your troops. Only they were sent to Antoine's house. He's arrested and he's deported and sent back to Spain. Miro's attitude is, look, I'm trying to put this colony under control. The last thing I need is a crazy priest introducing the Spanish Inquisition. When I read the communication of occupation, I shuddered. His Majesty ordered me to foster an increase in population. The mere name of the Inquisition uttered in New Orleans would be capable of driving away those who have recently come, Governor Miro. Pierre Antoine would come back. We don't know what happened to him, but something evidently did. In 1795, he would return, where now he's a different person. He lives a very simple, saintly life. He has these brown broadcloth robes with a wooden cross around his neck. He won't move into the plush furnishings of the rectory. He has a small hut built in St. Andrew Court, right behind the cathedral. And that's where he lives. He's given everything he's got to the poor. And in fact, when people came up to him, poor people, if they were hungry, he would take them by the hand and bring them to one of the local restaurants. And the restaurateur would provide necessary food. If they needed clothes, he'd find clothes. So he was this one-man mission, and everybody loved him. He married people in the church, black or white. It made no difference. There was no discrimination in the church. When you came into the church to sit, you sat where you chose. All were the same and equal in the eyes of the Lord. So as a result, he was extremely deeply loved and perceived to be a saint. When he died, his funeral became a major New Orleans event. Women were doing black dresses, men put black armbands on, and they wore them for days during the funeral process, all in acknowledgement of who he was and what he had contributed. He wanted to be buried in a simple grave right in the back, but the people loved him too much, so they placed him under the floor of the St. Louis Cathedral. So if you go there, you'll see the final resting place. Fire. Disasters do happen. If you notice the New Orleans French Quarter, the Spanish architecture, it's tile roofs, slate roofs, arches, it's brick with adobe, wrought iron, cast iron. It doesn't look French. That's because the early French city was wood. And it wasn't ornate by any means. It met the needs. 1788, it's Good Friday, March 21st, 1788, 1:30 p.m. Vicente Jose Nunez. This is Good Friday, and Spanish Catholics are very, 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 very religious. Each one generally has a small altar with a kneeler somewhere in their home, preferably by a window, where they say their morning prayers. Vicente said his prayers, but he made a mistake. He didn't blow out the candles. He got up and he left. A breeze picked up. The lace drapes flew, touched upon the candle. The drapes caught on fire, burned to the ceiling. The room was set on fire. The fire spread to the house. It broke through the roof and started spreading embers to surrounding property. Soon the room, everything was engulfed in flames. A strong south wind had grown up, which fed the flames, and the fire department was not properly notified about the fire. Why? The only way of notifying people in emergency were the church bells. Father Sedela, Pierre Antoine, is there. People run to the church to have him ring the church bells to set out the alarm that there's a major fire growing in the city. Father Sedela wouldn't allow it. Why? It's Good Friday. Anyone who's a Catholic is probably aware that after Holy Thursday, they no longer ring bells in church. In place of bells, they have two pieces of wood they clap together. You don't ring bells, which are considered celebratory, until Easter Sunday. So the idea of ringing the church bells on Good Friday afternoon was a violation of everything the priest believed in and was taught. So he refused. As a result, there was no way to get the people acknowledging that there was a major fire. Within 4 to 5 hours, 800 to 900 buildings had been consumed. 4/5 of the city was devastated. Value then about $3 million. The only structures that survived was the Ursuline Convent and a few houses around it. The church, the cabildo, the presbytery, government buildings, everything was gone. As the story goes, as the fire was heading towards the Ursuline nuns, they grabbed a statue of Our Lady of Prompt Succor, prayed around it, begging to be saved. And at the last minute, the wind shifted, blew back over the existing ruins, and the Ursuline Convent was saved. It was perceived by the nuns to be a miracle. The levee became a campground. People just moved out there. They set up whatever material they could for tents, and they just didn't know what to do. You didn't have FEMA, you didn't have insurances to speak of. People were absolutely devastated. Andreas Almanasta, who was the richest man in the city, put up money to rebuild the Catholic Church, the cathedral, the rectory, and the cabildo, as well as a charitable hospital. This is an area that was caught in flames. This is a statue of Our Lady of Prompt Succor. Recovery was a quote here at the time. In place of a flourishing city of the day before, we could see nothing more than ruins and debris. Still smoking. But we found all the compassion we could expect in our governor's generous heart and the quickness of perception to dry our tears a little and supply our needs. He made sure everyone was sheltered. He locked prices in place so there could be no speculation. He had shipments brought in from upriver, some as far away as Philadelphia, sent flour and food for making bread. 11 days after, Don Belcham Gravia and his wife drew up a plan to subdivide their plantation for settlement upriver. That's above Canal Street. That'll become the American sector. In 1794 was the second fire. Not as serious, but it did damage. Started with children were playing with fire, as you'd expect, near a haystack. It caught on fire, spread. It took 3 hours to control it, and 212 buildings were destroyed. So between these two fires, the city of New Orleans was pretty well devastated. This is one of the few French buildings that remain, Madame John's legacy. So you can see what French architecture looks like in comparison to that of Spain. The other one is Lafitte's blacksmith shop. So the Spanish introduced new building codes. All buildings over 1 story must be made of brick and adobe. All must have tile or slate roofs. And they had a chimney tax to cover for fire equipment. They didn't have fire departments like we have with water. They didn't have pumped water. All they could do was run into the house, have bags to collect a person's belongings, and then with their hatchets and poles, they would knock down the surrounding houses to isolate the fire. So you didn't want your neighbor's house to catch on fire. So these are now the new Creole townhouses that are coming up. You can see the arches. You can see that it's an adobe, a tile roof, and wrought iron. This is the Spanish architecture that's introduced after the fire. These are some of the remaining, I guess you say, French Creole cottages, but even they now have all tile roofs. This is the courtyard in the back. Where they were built, you'd have a carriageway, so there'd be a carriage place underneath here, your slave quarter here, your main building here, where you lived upstairs, and down below, a lot of times there would be a business, and this is your wrought iron. The wrought iron was mostly done by free men of color. This is what the houses look like, the different rooms. So here you have your shop, your carriageway. Your kitchen was always separate in case there was a fire. This is a room, the shop. This would be a storeroom. Your staircase, we have rooms that are bedrooms. You'd have your salon here and your open gallery, and your bathroom is in the back. These would be additional bedrooms or storage, whatever you wanted to use them for. This is a carriageway. Now they're just used in the for the courtyards, access to the courtyards. You can see here the beautiful cast iron. Cast iron is different than wrought iron. Wrought iron is done like coal forge, where you hammer it and you shape it. Cast iron is done by taking a mold, pressing it into clay, and then pouring cast iron, pouring liquid iron over the top. And when it dries, you lift it out the clay, and you have all these shapes on it. You just have to polish and clean it up. So these are all cast iron. And you can see this is cast iron up close. This is wrought iron. So each circle, each piece is shaped and made by hand and then forged together, forge welded together. This is a wrought iron gate. 1788 census, there were 19,500 whites, 1,700 free blacks, 21,000 slaves. So you can see here that the black population is much greater than the white population. They had gained 10,000 people in 3 years. During Merrill's administration, Louisiana blossomed into a functioning colony, fully capable of sustaining itself. The increase in number of viable colonists provided the colony the type of people it needed. These are the kind of people you build a colony with, not what the French were bringing in. But on the negative side, you had the fires and this constant inflow of Americans. And the people who were coming in as Americans, for the most part, in the early days, some were businessmen, but a lot were riverboat men, flatboat men. These guys were rough and tumble. When they hit the city, all they wanted to do was drink, carouse, gamble, and fight. And that caused a lot of anger among the Spanish, who preferred a carefully controlled religious, moral community. But they needed to trade. Governor Carondelet, 1791. He's called the Baron. Official title, look at this name. Don Francisco Luis Hector Baron de Carondelet de Noyer, Señor de Jaén Saint Pierre, Knight of St. John, Brigadier of His Majesty, Governor of San Salvador. Imagine writing that on a check. His unofficial name was Cochon de lait, the suckling pig. He was short, a little heavyset, sweet guy. Everybody really loved him. Completely honest, and he was good administration. So what was his problem? His problem was the French Revolution. Accomplishments. He divided the city into 4 wards, placed a police commissioner in charge of each ward. Commissioners kept a list of citizens and added names of newcomers. So if you moved into a community, you just didn't move in and that was it. When you moved into the community, you had to go to the police officer, to the commissioner, let him know who you were and where you'd be living. And that way they knew who it was about. Established a strong building code. There'd be no wooden houses built. Established a fire department. Installed street lighting. New Orleans is one of the first cities to have street lighting. And all it was a cable run diagonally across an intersection with a gas lantern hanging on it. That was it. It could have been kerosene. We didn't have kerosene then. It could have been oil, whale oil lamp. It was an oil lamp, but it provided lighting, and that would reduce the crime. He also set up riverboat patrols, because before that, the riverboat men fought amongst themselves to get into the port. Now you had police on the river that were telling people where they parked their boats, and there was no arguing, also collecting taxes. He adjusted the slave code to protect slaves from arbitrary punishment, which must mean there was arbitrary punishment taking place, and established civil guardsmen police officers, groups of 4, flintlocks, bayonets, uniforms, walking the streets, being available in case anyone needed them, and having their presence there to let criminals know that we are here, something we have to consider again. His reign, 3 hurricanes went through the city during his time. The 1794 fire, and during his time, the Carondelet Canal was built. That's why it was called that. The back of the city is where ships came in. They couldn't fight the current of the Mississippi. So they would park in the back of the city. And I think I mentioned this in an earlier lecture. And they would offload everything into small boats, go up Bayou St. John as far as it went. They'd offload it onto carts and bring it up Bayou Road to the city. So Carondelet's idea was, that's a waste of energy. Let's just dig a canal behind the city and connect it to Bayou St. John. And in that way, when you offloaded the big ships onto small boats, they can come all the way up to the back of the city, unload there. There'll be warehouses. There's a turning basin where they could turn their boats around and head back out again. And that's what he did. The first newspaper, Le Moniteur de la Louisiane, was published by Louis Duclos. It was a French newspaper. The first theater. It was developing a reputation for fast and high living with a high dose of danger. Depending on where you went, you could come here and have a wonderful time, but you could also lose your life or get robbed. There were yellow fever epidemics. That's a whole different lecture that we won't be getting into in this. But yellow fever was a horrible disease, and it followed basically from Africa. So it's a kind of a result of the slave trade. It reared its head every year, generally between May and October, and killed about 500 a year. In 1752, it killed 10,000 people in New Orleans in 1 year. But the big thing that influenced him was the French Revolution. This is the Carondelet Canal, going from the back of the city all the way straight shot to Bayou Avenue. Here it is again down here. This is what the turning basin looked like with the boats loaded in it. By the way, the turning basin is where Basin Street is when it was filled in. Water was only 6 feet deep. There's another view. French Revolution. As I said, the French Revolution wasn't one, but it was 5 revolutions, one sequentially behind the other. Each would consume its fathers. That's usually the process of revolution. You start a revolution, then you end up getting killed by it, and somebody else takes over. It's got to run its cycle. And that's what happens with the French Revolution. At one point, Spain and France were joined, but then when the revolution continued and it did away with the monarchy, the Spanish monarchy would join with the British, the Austrians, and such the like, the Russians, to suppress this revolution because they thought it was an overall threat to monarchy, which they were right about. And the slogan of the French Revolution was liberty, equality, fraternity. After Louis XVI and wife Marie Antoinette were executed, war broke out between England and Spain and France. So the Frenchmen living here found themselves in a situation where the leadership that was Spanish was at war with the country they had the strongest attraction for. So tensions naturally erupted. As I said, at one point during this revolution, French Revolution, slavery was outlawed, which caused a revolution in Haiti. And when the Paris Terror exploded, some members of the royal family rushed to Louisiana. The terror was part of the Jacobins, where anybody who was in any way associated with the Ancien regime, which was the old regime, was executed. Literally put in a cart, brought down to the main street of Paris, where a guillotine was set up, and had your head lopped off. I mean, it was incredibly cruel and incredibly indiscriminate. And it happened really not just in Paris, but throughout France. The amount of bloodshed was so great, especially if the king was killed, that a lot of the royalists left. They didn't want to go anywhere else in Europe. They were afraid. So some came to Louisiana. And when they came to Louisiana, it calmed things down a little bit because then they realized the French Revolution had gotten out of control and good people were being killed. And it kind of calmed things a bit. But at the same time, Carondelet had to take a stand. So any revolutionary literature publication was a crime. You'll be arrested and sent away from the colony and imprisoned in Cuba. Troops were sent to Natchez just in case there'd be problems there. They were starting to settle again. The situation degenerated. At that point, people started calling him Couchon de lait and ridiculing some of the French. They paraded around New Orleans threatening to use a guillotine on the Spanish authorities. Then there was a slave insurrection in Point Coupé, resulting in a hanging of 26 slaves. Some think that the slave rebellion was directly tied to the Haitian rebellion, which was directly tied to the French Revolution. It was a continuum there. Carondelet diffused the situation by allowing members of the French nobility into the colony. They were conservative. They were truly French, which reinforced the attraction of the French population for them. And then when they heard what was actually happening, it calmed them down. Fewer than 100 Louisianians were forced to leave the colony, and only 12 were imprisoned. The last three Spanish governors, Manuel Gayoso, educated in England, he was popular, but dominated his problem was American immigration. He arrived and he shortly died of a fever. It could have been anything. It could have been cholera. It could have been yellow fever. We don't know. But he didn't last long. He was immediately replaced by Casacalvo. He was an acting governor and only served for a short time. And the last one was Don Manuel Salcedo. He was a military man. He arrived in 1801. He was elderly. And he wasn't too popular because it was then realized that the Treaty of San Ildefonso was signed soon after he arrived, turning Spain back to France. And that's the Louisiana Purchase. And that's what we'll have to start getting into. He was dull, senile, very superstitious, and he had a very short rule before the transfer to America took place. So Spanish influence, it flourished. The colony finally flourished, the population increased. New colonies were brought in, new laws were enforced, a moderate slave code imposed. Spanish trade laws were relaxed to allow the flourishing of the economy. The city, after the fire, was totally rebuilt with modern building codes. Constables were hired to protect the citizens. That means good police work. And a successful stable crop was introduced, sugar. So in a relatively short time, the Spanish turned this Louisiana colony into a successful place. The end of Spanish control, and the French would then return. Next time, we'll talk about the Louisiana Purchase. Take care, and please enjoy.